Could this be the week that Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall finally arrive in 2024? We're about to dive into my quick and dirty top 36 running backs for week 6. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today. We're talking about my top 36 running backs for week 6 fantasy football. Now, as you can tell, we've broken our ranking shows up by position, a quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end ranking show from now on. And we've done that because a lot of people were leaving comments on our ranking show saying, hey, I kind of wish you'd go a little bit more in depth. But when you're trying to talk about 150 players in less than 30 minutes, it's really hard to go in depth on anyone. So we decided to go back to how we used to do things and have one show per position, but don't worry, they'll all be posted prior to Thursday Night Football, so you should be good to go. Now, before we dive into the top 36, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, Turtle Beach. And let's be honest, all of us have that guy in their friends group who's got the crappy headset that's battery always seems to die right at the end of the game, right? There's 2 teams left and your buddy Jimmy's just gone. So that's why you need to head over to turtlebeach.com and get yourself the Stealth 700. That thing has an 80-hour battery life, absolutely nuts. Now, Turtle Beach has more than just headsets, though. They got every gaming accessory you could really ever want. High quality, lower prices, they're not gonna break the bank. Everything from flight and racing simulators, controllers, keyboards, mice, whatever it is, Turtle Beach is the ultimate gaming cheat code. But there ain't no one out there wanting to pay full price, so now you can get the ultimate gaming experience at turtlebeach.com for a little bit of a discount using the promo code Headliners at checkout. Using that Headliners promo code is going to get you 10% off your entire order. So once again, head over to turtlebeach.com and get 10% off your entire order with promo code Headliners. They actually sent me one of these Stealth 700s right here, and yeah, I'm looking forward to checking this bad boy out. But first, let me bring up a few of my bigger hits and misses from just last week here at the running back position. For my hits, how about Ramondre Stevenson? So many people worried about him not being the quote-unquote starter. We made direct eye contact last week and said, do not worry about the coach speak. Starting doesn't matter. Touches do, and Ramondre Stevenson still got the touches. He continues to produce at a high level. We had him ranked super high last week, and same with James Conner. A lot of people didn't expect him to have a solid game against San Francisco. We still did. He performed. A few of the bigger misses, Jordan Mason in a great matchup going up against Arizona. He was a disappointment. How about Tank Bigsby? Dude is on another level right now, but he's also averaging over 9 yards a carry, so that is not going to be sustainable rest of season. But obviously I didn't have him ranked high enough, just like I didn't have Rico Dowdle ranked high enough as well, his best game of the year. Now obviously for the majority of this season so far, the Dallas running game has not been great, but he got some volume, he did something with it, and I didn't have him ranked high enough last week either. But week 5 is in the rear view. Let's talk about week 6. Now let's dive into some rankings. Let's bring up tier 1 for the running back position. And right here in tier 1, we got Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Alvin Kamara, Jordan Mason, Josh Jacobs, and Bijan Robinson. Now for Derrick Henry, he's got a matchup this week going up against Washington. Henry hasn't had less than 10 fantasy points in a game this season. In fact, he scored at least 16 fantasy points in 4 straight ball games. Now Washington allows over 20 fantasy points per game to the running back position. Honestly, if I have any concerns this week for Derrick Henry, it's a negative game script. If Washington can get a big lead early, maybe we see a little bit more Justice Hill than we want. But I can also really see Baltimore wanting to run the football a lot to start the game with King Henry. Get a lead. Keep the ball away from Washington. They can't put points on the board if they don't have the football. Control that time of possession with King Henry. That's why he's at number 1. Number 2, it's Saquon Barkley in a matchup going up against Cleveland. Glad to have Saquon back off his bye week. And honestly, this Cleveland defense just isn't what it used to be. As of right now, Barkley is the running back 3 overall on the season, and he's already had his bye week. That's how many points he's scoring. In an offense that's going to give him touchdown chances every single week, plus we should see A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith back this week as well, Saquon Barkley all the way up at number 2. Number 3, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions in a matchup going up against Dallas. Talk about an underperforming defense. Dallas allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Gibbs is averaging over 16 fantasy points per game and hasn't had less than 14 fantasy points in a game this season. Now they're coming off a bye week, they're fully rested, and had an extra week to prep for this game, I got Jahmyr Gibbs at number 3, which then brings us down to Alvin Kamara with a matchup this week going up against Tampa Bay. He's currently the number 1 overall running back in fantasy football, averaging almost 23 touches a game. And now with the Derek Carr injury, those touch totals may not come down anytime soon. In a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, they allow the 11th most fantasy points per game, right around 20 fantasy points per contest to opposing running backs. Alvin Kamara and all his volume is at number 4. Number 5 is Jordan Mason of the San Francisco 49ers going up against Seattle. People are somewhat frustrated by his sub 10-point games 2 of the last 3 weeks, but he's averaging 22 touches a game. He's the current running back 5 overall, and now he has a matchup going up against Seattle, who allows 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I still got him in the top 5 at number 5. Then I have Josh Jacobs going against Arizona. In the games that Jordan Love has played, Josh Jacobs hasn't scored any less than 11 fantasy points per contest. Now a matchup going up against Arizona, who has allowed over 130 yards rushing in 4 of the 5 games they've played this season, which in turn means they're allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Josh Jacobs up here in tier 1 this week, and then Bijan Robinson in a matchup going up against Carolina. Speaking of frustration, a lot of people are frustrated with Bijan Robinson. They expected more, but he was dealing with a hamstring injury prior to week 5. Maybe the reason we saw as much Tyler Algier as we did last week was the fact that Bijan Robinson just wasn't 100%, but he's currently the running back 21 overall. However, only 10 points away from being up inside the top 12 running backs, and he could make up those 10 points this week in a matchup going up against Carolina. They allow almost 30 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's second most in the NFL, and it's the reason why I had to keep Bijan up inside of tier 1. Which will bring us down to tier 2 now, where I have Breece Hall, James Conner, David Montgomery, James Cook, Kenneth Walker, Chuba Hubbard, Tony Pollard, and DeAndre Swift. And at the top of tier 2, we got Breece Hall. Is this the week that we can get something from Breece? Is this a Breece Hall problem, or is this a Jets overall offensive problem? Now, if you're asking me, I believe it's a Jets offense problem, and maybe the firing of head coach Robert Saleh makes things a little bit better. Maybe it doesn't, but this matchup is great. They're going up against Buffalo, and there is no team in the NFL that allows more fantasy points per game to opposing running backs than the Buffalo Bills. They're allowing over 30 fantasy points per game. This has to be a get-right game for Breece Hall. How do you succeed as an interim head coach in the NFL? You feed your studs and hope they can carry you. Now, after Breece Hall, we got James Conner in a matchup going up against Green Bay, currently the running back 9 overall. He's had at least 13 fantasy points in 4 of the 5 games he's played this season, has 19 plus touches in 4 of the 5 games this season, and has had 100 plus total yards in 3 of his last 4. Now he has a matchup going up against Green Bay, who's allowed at least 120 rushing yards in 4 of their 5 games played. Arizona is going to have to run the ball again, keep the ball away from Jordan Love in that Green Bay offense by running James Conner continually on the ground once again. Now, after him is where we have David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Yes, we know he's splitting touches with Jahmyr Gibbs, but despite having his bye week as well, he's still the running back 13 overall. In fact, since joining the Lions, he has had a touchdown in 17 of his 21 games. Now a matchup going up against Dallas. They allow the 5th most fantasy points per game, coming off the bye week with the extra week to prepare. I got David Montgomery all the way at number 10. At 11, it's James Cook going up against the Jets. Now, no, this is not the best matchup. The Jets allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game in the league. Now, can Josh Allen move the ball through the air enough to open up running lanes? Because we've seen James Cook be explosive in 2024. He's had at least 85 total yards in 4 of his 5 games this season, but there is something we need to pay attention to. He was added to the injury report with a toe issue, so pay attention to him throughout the remainder of the week. Now, after him is where we have Kenneth Walker going up against San Francisco. He's coming off a season low in touches in week 5, but the team was trailing most of the second half, and that really didn't help things. I do love that Kenneth Walker continues to be involved in the passing game, though. He continues to score at least 11 fantasy points per game, and we just saw James Conner get 100 total yards on this same San Francisco defense last week, which then takes us down to Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers going up against Atlanta, and I really doubt anyone had Chuba Hubbard as being the RB8 overall in fantasy football through 5 5 weeks of the 2024 season. But he has 3 straight games with at least 15.5 fantasy points. But something that does need to be mentioned is all 3 of those games came against teams who allowed top 5 fantasy points per game to the running back position. This won't be a cakewalk, but his involvement in this offense with Andy Dalton under center cannot be ignored. After him, we have Tony Pollard going up against Indianapolis. He's coming off the bye week. He's had at least 12 fantasy points per game in 3 of his 4 games. Indianapolis allows the 9th most fantasy points per contest to running backs. We know that Will Levis is dealing with a shoulder injury, and the running game here in Tennessee could be relied upon a little bit more heavily than maybe we've seen to start the season. Then we have DeAndre Swift going up against Jacksonville. He has exploded in back-to-back weeks. He had more fantasy points in week 5 alone than he had in the first 3 weeks of the season combined. He's had at least 120 total yards and a touchdown in back-to-back games. Now a matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow 24 fantasy points per contest, 6th most in the league. Which takes us down to tier 3 now. We got Brian Robinson, Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris, Chase Brown, Travis Etienne, Tyrone Tracy, and Rico Dowdle. Now for B-Rob, he's got a tough matchup going up against Baltimore, but he's currently the running back 7 overall. He's had at least 10 fantasy points in all 5 games this season. However, he did just have a season low in yardage last week with only 18 total yards. Now, he didn't really get a chance to do much because he also only had 7 total touches. We know he's dealing with a knee injury, and now a matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I had to drop him down to number 16. How about 17? It's Ramondre, I'm not the starter, Stevenson. He had his best game since week 1 last week. A lot of people gave up on the dude because he had some bad games against San Francisco and the New York Jets. Those are not some cream puff matchups. He's still up inside the top 20. He has 3 games with at least 16 fantasy points, but now he's going up against Houston that allows the 9th fewest fantasy points per league, plus he's missing practice and currently limited. He was banged up late in week 5, so he is another name we need to pay attention to make sure we know his availability heading into the weekend. After him, we got Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers in a great matchup going up against Las Vegas. Now, Najee hasn't been very good, but he hasn't been very bad either. Actually, he's been pretty average. He's averaging right around 9 fantasy points per game, but he is getting 18 touches per contest with Jaylen Warren and Cordero Patterson banged up. Really? It's the lack of touchdowns that's killing Najee right now. Justin Fields is stealing them around the goal line, but a matchup against Las Vegas, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game, could get Najee back on track. After him is Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the New York Giants. 2 good games, and he's already up inside the top 24 overall running backs on the season. Now, Zach Moss, he twisted his ankle late in week 5. A matchup going up against the New York Giants, they allow 18.2 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Honestly, Chase Brown is the more explosive runner, and if Moss is limited at all, we're going to see this dude ceiling more times than not. After him, we move down to Travis Etienne in a matchup going up against the Chicago Bears. Now, Etienne isn't more inefficient this year. The biggest problem is his volume is down by 5 carries a game compared to last year. And that's really because Tank Bigsby is out there earning touches. Now a matchup going up against Chicago, they allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Yes, Tank is going to be a part of the picture. But the coaching staff of Jacksonville has already come out and said, listen, Travis is our guy. Do not be surprised if we get a confidence-boosting game for Travis Etienne here in the very near future. Now, after Etienne, I got Tyrone Tracy of the Giants going up against the Bengals, and he looked really good last week in the absence of Devin Singletary. Tyrone Tracy had 18 carries for 129 yards on the ground. Now, does Devin Singletary return from his groin injury? Because this matchup is great. Cincinnati allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now that they've seen that Tyrone Tracy can handle the rock, do they rush back Devin Singletary? It's an injury to pay attention to, but do not be surprised if Tyrone Tracy didn't earn more volume going forward, even if Singletary is healthy. Now, after him, we move on to the last guy in this tier. It's Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys going up against the Detroit Lions. And if you've been here for a while, you know we talked about Rico Dowdle this entire offseason, and now he's starting to get a pretty good opportunity. Back-to-back games with at least 12 fantasy points, but this is not the matchup to get excited about. The Detroit Lions allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, and they're coming off the bye week where they had extra time to prep for this matchup. Rico Dowdle's up inside the top 24, but barely. which takes us through tier 3. Now we move down to tier 4. Here in tier 4, we got Javonte Williams, Trey Sermon, J.K. Dobbins, Bucky Irving, Austin Eckler, Jerome Ford, and Tyler Algier. But we'll start off at number 23 is Javonte Williams. He's coming off his best game of the season. Now, is it him and the offense, or was it just a matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders that gave him that success? Because he still has no touchdowns on the season, and now they have a matchup going up against a much tougher defense in the Los Angeles Chargers. They allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, given the volume and the bye weeks that we currently have, Javonte Williams is still a flex play for me here this week, which then brings us down to Trey Sermon of the Indianapolis Colts going up against the Tennessee Titans. Jonathan Taylor still dealing with that high ankle sprain, which means we're probably going to see Trey Sermon once again. Now, he had 63 yards on 16 touches, but he was really saved by a touchdown. Really, everything here is tied to the quarterback situation, though. If it's Anthony Richardson, I don't really care for Trey Sermon much in fantasy. If it's Joe Flacco, yes, we're going to have added touchdown opportunities, and Flacco isn't going to steal goal line carries. Now, this Tennessee run defense is really middle of the pack, so if Joe Flacco starts, Trey Sermon's up inside the top 24. Then we have J.K. Dobbins going up against Denver. He's coming off his bye week, but this Denver defense is playing a lot better here as of late. They're a top 10 run defense in the NFL. Dobbins himself, he hasn't had 10 fantasy points in a game since week 2, and if we've seen anything this year, it's that he's struggled against better defenses. Now, obviously, he has that home run ability, so he's still right here at the bottom of the top 25. Then we have Bucky Irving going up against the New Orleans Saints, and touches have been pretty consistent this season for Bucky Irving. But it's not just his touches, his overall metrics across the board are pretty consistent week in and week out. He's had some tough matchups against Philadelphia, Denver, and Detroit, and he's going to remain a flex play this week going up against New Orleans. With the Derek Carr injury, I can see Tampa Bay getting a lead in this game and running the ball a lot in the second half. Those are the type of games that Bucky Irving could feast in, so that's why I got him at 26. 27, it's Austin Eckler going up against Baltimore. Everyone knows that Brian Robinson isn't 100% healthy, and he's currently getting fewer touches. We also see that Austin Eckler is out there averaging a career high 10 yards per touch. If we can get him anywhere near 10 touches a week, the dude is going to remain a solid flex play. Which then takes us down to Jerome Ford in a matchup going up against Philadelphia. And honestly, Jerome Ford is really being affected by how bad this overall offense is in Cleveland. They're constantly trailing. They can't run the football, which means his touches are going to be inconsistent weekly. He's going to have minimal touchdown chances. And if anything, Deshaun Watson is looking worse week after week. Now he gets a matchup going up against Philadelphia, who's much easier to throw on than run on. The only reason Jerome Ford is still this high is he's been involved in the passing game. He's been getting some check downs here as of late. So for all of you who play in PPR leagues, he's still a low-end flex option. Then we got Tyler Algier going up against Carolina. If Bijan Robinson still isn't 100% healthy, what are the chances we see Atlanta lean a little bit more on Tyler Algier, especially against the Carolina Panthers? The Panthers allow the second most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and an Atlanta lead could mean we see a whole lot of Tyler Algier in the second half of that ball game. Which then brings us down to our last tier, tier 5, where we have Cam Akers, Tank Bigsby, Rachaad White, Justice Hill, Zach Moss, Braylon Allen, and Roschon Johnson. Now for Cam Akers, he's got a matchup going up against the New England Patriots, and as of right now, we do not know whether or not Joe Mixon is going to return. So we'll treat this as another Cam Akers game where he's only had one game all year with more than 50 yards. Now a matchup going up against New England, they do allow 21.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so not a bad matchup. The biggest issue we have here is he's 100% touchdown dependent. And even though he's the leader in the backfield, he's not getting all the touches. It really limits his overall ceiling. After him, we got Tank Bigsby going up against Chicago. And yes, he is playing great right now, but he's also averaging 9.5 yards per carry, and that is not sustainable. Now a matchup going up against Chicago. They allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but this timeshare with Travis Etienne is going to continue. Etienne is still the number one there, and like I mentioned a little bit earlier, do not be surprised if we don't see a Travis Etienne confidence-boosting game here in the near future. Now, this is no disrespect to Tank Bigsby. I just can't count on a running back getting 9.5 yards per carry every week. After him, it's Rachaad White going up against the New Orleans Saints. Still not very efficient, but now he's also in a 50-50 split with Bucky Irving. He has no touchdowns on the season. His passing work has been inconsistent from week to week. In fact, he actually had -6 yards receiving just last week. We can live with all the inefficiencies on the ground if it's being propped up by the passing work. -6 yards receiving is not being propped up by the passing work. So because of all those inefficiencies, I got Rachaad White at 32. Then we got Justice Hill going up against Washington. He really is a game script type of guy. But what a better time to maybe need him than in a matchup against the #1 scoring offense in the NFL, the Washington Commanders. If Washington can pull ahead of the Baltimore Ravens, we're going to see more Justice Hill touches. And we've already seen when he gets touches, he puts up fantasy points. After him, we got Zach Moss going up against the Giants, really losing a lot of upside here due to Chase Brown, plus he's dealing with a sprained ankle. He really needs a touchdown to have a decent fantasy day, and those chances are dwindling by the week due to Chase Brown. After him, we got Braylon Allen going up against Buffalo. You really have to think the coaching staff is in damage control mode here, and they're going to let A-Rod and Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall just eat. Now, because of that, Braylon Allen may not get guaranteed touches, but it is a great matchup for running backs, so I put him down here at 35, and then lastly, it's Roschon Johnson going against Jacksonville, a very touchdown-needy running back. Roschon Johnson only has 51 total yards over his last 2 weeks combined, but he's being propped up by 3 touchdowns in those 2 games. We know DeAndre Swift is playing well, and he's getting the bulk of the volume. But now in a matchup going up against Jacksonville, they allow the 6th most fantasy points per game. It could lead to more touchdown chances for Roschon Johnson. So there you have the quick and dirty top 36 running backs for week 6 fantasy football. Now, like I say in almost all of my ranking shows, maybe your rankings don't match mine, and that's okay. They're not supposed to match. Don't get butthurt over fantasy football rankings. What we really need to do is come together as a community, so together we build the best damn rankings possible so we all just dominate. Now, before I get out of here for the day, I do want to take another quick second just to throw out thoughts and prayers to all of those affected by Hurricane Milton down in Florida. I know we've been saying that in numerous videos here over the last couple days, but this channel just feels like there's more important things than views and clicks and hot takes at times. So just know that Headliner Nation has got your back, Florida. But now I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, other channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.